afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar session organized by the Ahmad bin Khalifa University College of Law in partnership with Cambridge University Press, UK. I am Professor Damilola Olawi, and I will be moderating today's session. Special thanks to our event coordinator, Ms. Sandy Amonis, and to Heather McKay, Senior Marketing Executive at Cambridge University Press, for working tirelessly to make this event possible. Today's session will highlight key themes covered by the new book, Local Content and Sustainable Development in Global Energy Market, edited by myself and featuring contributions from experts from Africa, Asia, Australasia, Europe, Latin America, North America, and of course, here in the Middle East. It is my greatest pleasure to welcome some of the contributing authors who have agreed to share their insights with us. They will be discussing some of their key contributions to the book. And I will briefly introduce them. First, of course, we start from home here at HBKU. We have Susan L Carmanian, who is the Dean of the College of Law here at HBKU. And she contributed a very wonderful chapter that analyzes the human rights aspect of local content. Previously, she has held leadership positions. Before coming to HBKU, she had held positions at American University of Sharjah and at George Washington University Law School, where she was Associate Dean for many years. Susan is a member of the Executive Council of the American Society of International Law and was previously Vice President of ISO. She was also President of the Washington Foreign Law Society, and she has lectured on international law at the University of Paris, the OAS Academy of International Law, and many more. She has presented 2 eminent lectures as part of the United Nations Audiovisual Library of International Law, and she is the trustee of the Center for American and International Law, CALE. Of course, she's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the American Council on Germany, the American Bar Foundation, and the Texas Bar Foundation. You're welcome, Dean Carmanian. And next is Professor Catherine Burnett, PhD, who is an associate professor at the Scandinavian Institute of Maritime Law, the Department of Energy and Resources Law, University of Oslo, Norway. Her expertise cover areas of energy law, environmental law, competition law, EU law, and she's written extensively on renewable energy, support schemes, and alternative financing models, as well as energy market design. She's practiced extensively in Norway and France, and she's worked at the European Commission prior to joining the academia. She's a member of the advisory academic group to the International Bar Association, a section on energy, environment, and natural resources and infrastructure law, CIRIL for short. She's an academic fellow at the Center on Regulation in Europe, and she contributed a very insightful chapter to this book that evaluated local content in Norway. You're welcome, Catherine. Next is Professor Tina Sullivan-Hunter, who is a professor of energy and resources law at the Macquarie University in Australia. She teaches and researches in areas of petroleum law, specifically offshore petroleum law, Arctic resources law, and unconventional gas law. She's written extensively on the energy transition as well, and she's been one of the foremost speakers and writers and researchers in this field of local content, where she's contributed immensely as well. She's presently, she serves as an honorary professor at the University of Eastern Finland and as a visiting professor at the Biological Research Institute in Russia. She has taught law in numerous countries, including the United Kingdom, Australia, Norway, Canada, Iceland, Greece, Finland, Russia, and many more. And it is our greatest pleasure to welcome her. She contributed a chapter to this book that evaluated local content in Australia. Welcome, Professor Tina. Next is Dr. Eduardo Herrera, who is a professor of natural resources law and energy law, as well as a full-time scholar at the Siberian Federal University in Russia. And he has served as a part-time adjunct or visiting scholar in a number of leading academic institutions worldwide. He has been very active in the oil and gas industry for over 10 years and has served as an international expert in a number of projects. He has published extensively, several books, several articles, and he has both academic and practice experience that covers over 40 countries in America, Europe, Africa, and Asia. He obtained his PhD degree from the University of Aberdeen, focusing on oil and gas law, and he has worked with a number of research institutes, including the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and the Scandinavian Institute of Maritime Law in Norway. He is a managing editor of the African Journal on Energy and Natural Resources Law, and he contributed a chapter on local content in Brazil. And so it's our greatest pleasure to welcome Dr. Eduardo. You're welcome. And last but not the least is Professor Timothy Meyer, who is joining us from the United States. We are delighted he could join us. It's very early in the US right now, I think about 5 a.m. So thank you for joining us. He's a professor of law and director of the International Legal Studies program at the Vanderbilt Law School, United States. He's an expert in public international law with focus on international trade and investment law and international energy governance. He has written extensively on these topics, especially the role of constitutional separation of powers in US international economic policy making. His research has also covered the role of local governments in free trade agreements, and he has published in a number of leading journals, including the Columbia Law Review, University of Pennsylvania Law Review, California Law Review, and a lot more. He is the author of a book on international soft law with Oxford University Press, and he has just released another edited work in this field. Prior to joining Vanderbilt, he taught for many years at the University of Georgia School of Law, and he also served for several years at the U.S. Department of State, the Office of Legal Advisor, where he represented the United States in commercial arbitration. Before joining the State Department, he was a law clerk for Justice Neil Gorsuch, where he sat on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. Professor Meyer obtained his BA and MA from Stanford, and he obtained his JD and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. It's our pleasure that Professor Tim contributed a chapter that evaluated the America First policy and how that connects to local content and sustainable development. So welcome, Professor Timothy Meyer. Well, so you'll agree with me that we have a very wonderful and very fantastic roster of speakers, and we look forward to their contributions. But before we go on, I just want to share a few housekeeping rules. I would encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A tab, which is on the lower side of the WebEx screen. If you click on the 3 dots, you will be able to do that. And we will, if you can please direct your questions to the panelists, and at the end of the presentations, then we'll take the questions. So I will just move on to produce, just to give you a very quick overview of the book. That is the cover page of the book. It looks very good. So what we will do today is just to, the book, we have about 21 chapters, so it's impossible to cover everything in one session like this. But we will, the speakers here today will discuss some of the key legal and institutional safeguards for designing and implementing sustainable local content policies. And, they will talk about how local content connects with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, especially the SDG 7 on energy for all and SDG 16 on human rights. We'll talk about the importance of networks and supplier development programs in order to achieve a more effective implementation of local content policies. And of course, we'll take lessons. Each of the speakers will provide lessons from their respective jurisdictions on how they've been able to address some of the practical concerns that have stifled the development and implementation of local content policies. Well, I will provide a very short overview of the nexus between local content and sustainable development. Before now, there have been a lot of books that addressed the issue of local content, but none did an extensive discussion of how it connects with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. So that is one key addition that this book has brought forward, connecting local content policies and seeing them as foundation for achieving the SDGs. Of course, this year, it's very important that we're launching this book in this new year, because the year 2020 was a challenging one for the whole world, in which we saw the impact of COVID-19, which affected all sectors, including the oil and gas sector and the energy sector generally. Oil prices fell dramatically, and this affected activities in the upstream, midstream, and downstream sectors of the energy industry. And of course, one thing that has happened is that the pandemic has forced everyone to stay local, stay wherever you are. There's no need to travel. So you have to stay local, you have to buy local, you have to act local. And so that emphasizes the fact that there could be no better time to be looking at local content policies, because now the whole world has to embrace local goods and local services due to the disruptions caused by the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, the push for local content policies has been on, and it has taken a global dimension. And local content policies, briefly, are policies and measures, provisions that aim to incentivize or mandate the use of local goods, the use of local services and labor in energy operations. And we'll see that over the last few years, you've seen a geometric rise in the introduction of local content policies, especially in developing countries, in Africa, in Latin America, and in the Middle East. In the next slide, you'll see that over 90% of research-rich countries worldwide have introduced at least one form of local content policy. 50% of such policies mandate the use of a minimum threshold, maybe 30%. Some go as far as saying 70% of the goods and services that you're going to use for this operation must come locally. It must be sourced locally. And in our region here, you've seen Qatar. Just this year, Qatar started its 13th program, which is Qatar's localization program for services and industries in the energy sector, which was introduced by Qatar's national oil company, Qatar Petroleum. And you've seen Saudi Arabia since 2015 implementing it in Kingdom Total Value Add program, the form of local content program introduced by Saudi Aramco. We've seen Oman's in-country strategy. These policies aim to achieve 5 main things. Number one is to ensure that they increase the domestic capabilities and competencies of home-based industries over time, such that there could be a reduced dependence on imported goods. Another aim, of course, is to ensure that home-based industries will be able to then continue to participate and take over some of these operations over time, rather than what we have now, in which many of these operations are basically dependent on foreign goods and services. Another goal is to create jobs, jobs and employment opportunities for locals, which without such policies might be difficult to channel. And another important goal of local content policies generally is to increase the technological capacity of a country and its infrastructure as well. Because by mandating that activities, goods should be sourced locally, then you can begin to create an infrastructure that will be sustainable, that will enable the country to function over time independently. And of course, one other key aim is that local content policies can help in redistributing the benefits of resource investment activities. Normally, if you sign a petroleum contract, your obligation might just stop at paying royalties and all of that. But with local content, it's beyond just paying the royalties. It's ensuring you can use local content policies to specify that at least 50% of those that you're going to employ should be women. because studies have shown that there is a huge gender imbalance in the oil and gas sector. So you could use local content policies to address issues like that. You could use it to address issues of indigenous benefits, which is one of the chapters covered by one of the issues covered by one of the chapters in this book. So these drivers or these reasons that these local content policies aim to achieve, they are all connected to the SDGs. Whether you are talking about creating jobs, which is totally connected with SDG 8, on decent work and economic growth. Whether you're talking about eradicating poverty, SDG 1, through local jobs, or whether you're talking about using local content to achieve gender balance, that which is which will cover SDG 5. And then of course we've seen countries like Tanzania, Kenya using local content to improve the development of locally made solar panels and to ensure that people at home can at least use their own soft technologies, which again will help advance SDG 7 on energy for all. But of course, despite these good objectives of local content, there have been debates on whether local content policies can be counterproductive themselves, especially when you don't have the goods and services at home. And one of the chapters by our colleague here, Professor Ezenagu, talked about the need for supplier development programs as well in order to address some of these local problems. You see, also there's been a lot of debate on whether local content policies do not even conflict with international obligations under trade, investment, environment, human rights, and other treaties. For example, SDG 1710 talks about, and SDG 2 as well. They both talk about the need to avoid trade restrictions, distortions, and the likes. So there is another question there, whether local content policies do not conflict or will not result in misalignment. So in order to address these issues, we brought together a wide range of speakers who could look at the current challenges, address some challenges such as lack of material at home. When there is no capacity or when there's no material at home, what do you do then? How do you address that? And how do you ensure that mandating local content will not even result in a country's overall investment climate being seen as maybe hostile or inconducive if companies are unable to meet those policies? So these are the questions that we will consider in today's session. How do we balance local content objectives with international treaty obligations to avoid misalignment? How do we support the practical implementation of local content policies in order to achieve successful outcomes? And what can countries like Qatar that are just starting in this local content approach, what can we learn from jurisdictions that have practiced or utilized local content policies for many years, such as Norway, Australia, Brazil, and the United States? So these are the issues that we'll be covering today, and I look forward to the presentations of my colleagues here. And we'll start immediately with Dean Susan Carmanian, who will be talking about the contentions or misalignments between local content policies and human rights. Over to you, Dean Susan.
Thank you very much, Damalola, for that very kind introduction and for the overview of the book. First, congratulations on the book as the leader, as the editor, as the person who came up with the vision. It's just been wonderful to work with you. And also congratulations to all the contributors. Further, I'd like to thank my fellow panelists and all the contributors on this important initiative. You just heard the value of local content requirements. I'm going to refer to them as LCRs. The notion of having government regulation helping build local indigenous capacity designed to ensure that the benefits of a state's resources, particularly natural resources, flow to citizens and inhabitants within the state. They seek to promote job creation, enhancement as well of domestic structures, infrastructures, important example. In principle, they are designed to prevent the reallocation of rents attributed to assets of the state from the home country to foreigners, with the expectation that the assets would stay under the control of the home state and benefit those within the state. Now, from this perspective, presumably LCRs would be enhancing the human rights of members of the local communities. We heard about the possibility of jobs. There are other economic and social benefits associated with this building of an infrastructure. They could benefit the local political and civic realm, as stability enables the broader development of the individual within the state. When more resources stay at home, the greater the opportunity for the allocation of those resources to essential services such as schools and hospitals and roads. And in addition, LCRs can be used to target specific industries such as the solar industry, which could lead to more affordable and sustainable sources of energy. One of the panelists, Professor Tim Meyer, has noted that LCRs targeting certain sectors, such as renewable energy, can have the potential to increase global welfare. Yet, LCRs are inherently discriminatory based on national origin. So that does defy the fundamental human rights principle of equality, reflected in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as many human rights treaties and constitutions worldwide. The equality principle is also set out in bilateral investment treaties and free trade agreements. Mind you, as to BITs and FTAs, the equality typically applies after the investment is in the country and the like. Second, though, and I think is really more important to the conversation today, is implementation of LCRs. LCRs have spawned new circumstances, particularly as to the relationship between indigenous companies, large indigenous companies which are given protection under the law and which may have their existence due to the local content requirement, and foreign investors. So we have a situation where perhaps the best of intentions could lead to some contrary results. These relationships implicate human rights such as the right to work and the right to payment for work, the right to a corrupt-free environment, and the like. Let me just give you 4 examples. The first is that LCRs have enabled large indigenous entities to enter into agreements with foreign investors, and these entities are designed to get the protection of the LCR. Invariably, the indigenous entity will enter into contracts with small to medium enterprises within the country. And these also are indigenous SMEs. In recent years, it's been reported that the SMEs are simply not getting paid on time, that there are no incentives built in for the larger companies that are getting the protection of the LCR to engage in best practices. Second, LCRs have prompted the practice of what is referred to as fronting, whereby local shell companies are set up to secure contracts with foreign investors without providing substantial benefits to the indigenous community. Now, mind you, there are regulations against this and the like, but this is a consequence of the LCR. Third, as Damalola referred to, LCRs have a strong economic component, yet they may neglect certain human aspects. And one of those, to fulfill local objectives fully, for all the objectives to be realized, is the need to have education, so that all parties that are affected by an LCR are aware of it and understand how it is to be implemented. And then the fourth element that touches on human rights is concerns about corruption throughout the process. And so with those 4 concerns that come to the fore, what I have done in my chapter is to think about ways in which human rights can be integrated into any LCR regime. States have a duty to protect, promote, and fulfill human rights. And so any LCR should be evaluated based on its human rights implications. In fact, one of the countries that I looked at, Nigeria, through its Nigerian Oil and Gas Industry Content Development Act, that country also has a bilateral investment treaty with Morocco. It's been signed, in which the states require the investors, the foreign investors, to comply with international human rights law as to their investments in the respective country. This fact, coupled with the country's obligations under human rights treaties, I would argue, means that human rights simply cannot be an afterthought. And so how do we integrate human rights into the LCR regime? The heart of my chapter then sets out a model. In particular, I go back to the Ewing United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And these were, of course, drafted under the auspices of Harvard professor John Ruggie. They have been endorsed by the United Nations Human Rights Council. And under the UN Human Rights Guiding Principles, states are required to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. That's not path-breaking, that has been well recognized. But also they have a duty to protect against human rights abuses by business enterprises. So this focus on the state's obligation to everyone to prevent entities from engaging in human rights abuses is important. But a second fundamental and path-breaking aspect of the UN Guiding Principles is that business enterprises are to comply with all applicable laws and, quote unquote, respect human rights. So the corporations have the duty to respect human rights. So in light of the guiding principles, then I set out a model in my paper for how local content requirements should be aligned with UN guiding principles. And I have four key aspects to this model. First, the local content requirement, the law, the regulation, should expressly state that its purpose is to promote the LCR objectives while fulfilling the state's human rights obligations. In other words, the LCR is a mechanism whereby the state expresses its duty to protect human rights. The second is that, as many of you know, states that enact local content requirements invariably may have a commission or an entity to supervise implementation. Well, I would argue that they should have a local content requirement human rights compliance body. This body would identify laws and other actions needed to ensure that business enterprises respect human rights. They would examine on an annual basis the human rights implications of the LCRs, and they would propose steps to cure any shortcomings. The body would consist of experts in the area of business and human rights. It would have the responsibility to report to a lawmaking authority within a state. It would have public meetings. It would issue an annual report, and also there would be a human rights assessment of any proposed license to be given to an investor. Third, all business entities are to respect human rights. The state laws should enable a full investigation, punishment, and redress of human rights violations. Secondly, and this is building on a lot of what Ruggie has developed, the notion that the companies, whether it be an indigenous company or a foreign investor, should be required to have a human rights policy. That policy has to be subject to audit and due diligence. And then the fourth feature would be a focus on transparency and anti-corruption. Public access to the local content requirement human rights compliance body is essential. There should be a review of the local content requirement rules to prevent any type of gifts or relationships being developed between an entity and the regulatory body. And this last point has been pointed out, has been raised specifically with regard to some aspects of the Nigerian law. Now, there are two major shortcomings with my proposal, and I'm sure there are others out there, but I address them in the paper. And the first is that LCRs already are heavy on the regulatory side. Through this model, we are bringing in more complexity, and through that, the possibility of more ambiguity, resources being allocated to governance and compliance, and not with the overall objective of creating jobs. Secondly, I think that one of the big issues is there capacity within business entities to develop human rights norms, to work in this space. So I will stop here, Damalola. But the one thing I would like to just leave just as a thought is that in any type of regulatory environment, particularly on the business side, I think it's important that a lot of these public-related issues, such as human rights, be considered. And I think this is a conversation about mainstreaming human rights norms into a number of aspects of business, here specifically in the content of local content requirements. So thank you very much. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Dean Susan, for the wonderful presentation. And I think Professor Catherine Burnett's chapter will build on some of that by giving us experience from Norway. A chapter in the book was titled "Local Content and Sustainable Development in Norway." So I'll just turn it over to Catherine immediately. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Damilola, and once again, congratulations with the book. I will just on my presentation that I hope you can see here. Here goes. So the purpose of my presentation is to present some of the lessons from the experience of local content requirements in national legislation in Norway. And to do that, I would like to first present the national context, highlight that there have been two periods really in local content policy in Norway. And I will review some of the measures, the need to adapt to liberalized integrated energy markets as the new normal that would probably apply in most of the countries looking at local content requirements today. And I will conclude with some key lessons from the Norwegian experience. First, yes, Norway, as you see, we hear it's cold today, and it's also a particular national context in terms of exploitation of natural resources, and in particular petroleum resources. When Norway discovered petroleum and on its continental shelf, its government had no petroleum legislation in place and no local content requirements governing that sector. So as a consequence, and because it was seen as necessary, the authorities had to elaborate a dedicated local content policy and adopt the associated legal requirements that will secure its implementation. And because Norway was not yet bound by any relevant European or international agreement, such as the GATT, it remained free to design its local content policy regime. And that's the main difference with the second historic phase that I will talk about, where they were bound by international agreements. So while pursuing those tasks, the Norwegian authorities have managed, in my view, to maintain a clear line as to what was the ultimate objective of their regulatory model, that is the maximization of national value creation and efficient resource management, that kind of mantra in natural resources policy in Norway. Local content legal framework was in place in Norway until the country joined the EEA agreement, the European Economic Area Agreement, and the World Trade Organization. But today there are currently no local content requirements in Norwegian legislation per se that will apply to the sector. Another starting point that is important to understand in the national context is the fact that Norway, when it discovered petroleum, was already self-sufficient in energy supply due to its rich hydropower resources. A second factor was that the country was already quite developed and it had well-working institutions, governance system, and legal system also functioning based on key principles of administrative law, rule of law, legality principle, case handling procedures, etc. And that benefited as well the implementation of those local content rules. So beyond those specific national circumstances, the question that I have investigated in the chapter was to identify the key components of that regime that could serve as a lesson for other jurisdictions, and what we can conclude from that. We can distinguish two historic phases in local content policy in Norway. The first one, which started in 1970s till the mid-1990s, is a period where we find explicit local content requirements with the purpose of ensuring sustainability in terms of jobs and development, social development. In the second phase, so from mid-1990s, the use of local content requirements has been constrained by the international obligations deriving from the entry into force of the European Economic Area Agreement in 1994, and as well both primary legislation, secondary legislation related to that, and the application of relevant WTO agreements after Norway joined in 1995, notably the TRIMS agreement and the GATS agreement. And Norway also entered into a series of bilateral investment treaties, BITs, which can't restrain the country's ability to include LCR. So that's the two phases that are telling the story of local content policy in Norway. An important starting point when we look at the legal measures that have been associated to legal content requirements is to understand the fact that there are some guiding principles in the relationship to international oil companies. Norway had no previous knowledge of the petroleum operations, and it was fundamental for them to attract a group of international companies, but as well a diverse group of international oil companies that will bring that competence. And it was key for the government authorities to secure both foreign capital and expertise and to put them into competition for delivering good services, affordable services, and benefits at the national level. That resulted also in a Norwegianization of the national petroleum industry, and it made it capable as well to compete internationally on the long term. The government remains in a leading position still today in different ways, but it also builds on some mechanism of trust, transparency that I will come back to. If we go now on the list of the concrete measures that have been applied, we find a balance between the incentives and the constraints, and we can, in popular terms, call them the carrots and stick. The carrots being, of course, getting revenues from the exploitation of the resources. So if we look a bit more on the list of the sticks, here we have first a duty to set up operating subsidiaries in Norway, which was early defined as a requirement for granting production license. Second, we find a preference given to national companies in licensing rounds, including operatorship. Licensing rounds became, over time, an increasingly powerful tool in local content policy. By prioritizing Norwegian companies, including state-owned, and developing Norwegian competencies by preparing them to compete internationally. So that was a necessary step that prepared Norway to the next phase. And this was done through the following requirements of mandatory state participation, establishment of national oil companies, preferences given to national oil companies, including the state-owned when the licenses were awarded, and operatorship given to Norwegian companies. Another instrument was the preference on the use of Norwegian goods and services on a comparative basis. This is also another important criteria. There was a preference, but it was based on a competitive element. And to monitor that preference given in awarding the contracts in the procurements, there was a goods and services office that was set, and which has notably the role to scrutinize, based on a reporting obligation, the manner those requirements of preference given to Norwegian goods and services was implemented. The next one, which is also a very classical requirement in terms of local content, is technology transfer and research cooperation. Although research cooperation was really instrumental in building local knowledge in Norway, this was done through mandatory requirements to collaborate with research institutions in the country. And an additional advantage for Norway was that North Sea presented additional challenges than, for example, the Gulf of Mexico, and the companies needed to develop new knowledge. And that new knowledge, those new methods, that was a very good opportunity to establish cooperation with R&D environments nationally. Another requirement relates to the obligation to bring petroleum ashore. Although most of the petroleum is exported without reaching the shore, but there was a requirement, and there's still, to some extent, a possibility of requiring bringing petroleum ashore. Finally, training of local personnel and government officials, also very classical requirement that we find in many local content policies. That was required, and it helped building competences at the level of the ministry, the Norwegian Directorate, the public entities, but as well at schools, and on teaching, for example, petroleum-related topics. So in conclusion, the local content policy conducted by the Norwegian authorities can be deemed to be successful if we look at the figure of the local content and the successful share of the markets. And it could be surprising when we take into account the relatively light compliance system, enforcement system, which was primarily based on few key obligations that I have detailed in the legislation, and a quite light enforcement system. We see that the Goods and Services Office based its review on reporting obligations. Meanwhile, it was effective. The objective of Norwegian authorities from the start has been to build an infant industry and prepare it to compete internationally while maximizing revenues. And that was revenues for the benefit of the country. And this objective was attained, we can say, by the end of the first period. So yes, Norway had a bit of luck as well, combined with a good governance system, which was adjusted all the time. And at the end of that first period, happened a series of events, and notably a drop in oil prices. And Norway joined a series of international agreements that would have made very difficult for Norway to continue with the same local content requirements. Therefore, there was multiple arguments in favor of changing those and removing those. In the second phase that I talked about, the use of local content requirements has been constrained by the obligation deriving principally from three international agreements. The first one is the European Economic Area Agreement. We have different provisions in terms of competition, internal market, free movement of services, capital, non-discrimination, and requirements in secondary legislation. The World Trade Organization, that is also further detailed in other chapters in the book, and some bilateral investment treaties, which also contain provisions that would constrain the use of local content requirements. So what are the key lessons? I think that Norway offers a good example of successful local content policy. This achievement is due to a combination of external framework conditions and careful design and implemented local requirements. Beyond those specificities, there is a series of lessons that can be drawn. And the first lesson is that the elaboration of a local content policy in the petroleum sector, but it can be used in other energy sectors as well, must take into account the general energy generation mix and sources of energy supplies of the country, as well as the structure of the regulatory framework. which has an impact in terms of governance and legal system. So take into account the broad picture. The second lesson is that the local content requirements should be temporary and, as far as possible, performance-based, because they will prepare the industry, the national industry, to compete internationally and to adapt to international norms and standards. If you look at a country that is collaborating regionally, that is in that process of integrated, liberalized energy markets, then the advice holds. Third, the adoption of local content requirements in Norway has been very progressive, step by step, and adjusted over time. It was a careful assessment all the way through, and based on the reaction of international companies, how far can we go? Maybe we need to adjust, area variation on the oil price, etc., etc. And fourth, in terms of legal approach, Norwegian regulation of LCRs can't be characterized as light touch regulation in law. So here there is a tight link to the type of legal regime which is in place. There was no law on local content, but some few key provisions inserted into the petroleum legislation. And those were supplemented by a well-integrated set of licensing and contractual requirements between parties. So a very light touch, but very well-articulated set of requirements. And this made the local content policy more flexible and easy to adapt to any development in the sector and between actors. So that's a summary of the lessons. I think that's a discussion that needs to be addressed in the Norwegian context and in other countries. That is the one of the use of local content requirements in other sectors like renewable energy, has been mentioned just before, and there are some also good lessons and interesting legal questions there. With that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And I think one of the key points you stressed is the need for flexibility in implementing local content policies, and also the need to think of local content policies as temporary measures, really, temporary performance-based measures that should be adjusted with the realities of the time. So thank you for those wonderful insights. And I would turn it over to Professor Tina Hunter. A chapter in the book is titled Sustainability and Local Content Requirement in Australian Oil and Gas Development as the Ship of Opportunity Sailed. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It gives me great pleasure to discuss the issue of local content. And more importantly, it's also fantastic to be going after Catherine. The reason I say that is when I wrote my doctorate about the idea of the state gaining benefit from the development of oil and gas, and actually it was a comparative study between Australia and Norway. So a large part of my PhD was actually looking at, why doesn't Australia do what Norway does? So this provides a perfect segue into the Norwegian study, from the Norwegian study into this. So I'm going to not only talk about Australia, but I want to draw and pick up a couple of points that Catherine has made and then either sort of shoot them down in the Australian perspective or talk about an enhanced role. And to start by doing that, what I want to do is actually discuss or sort of highlight Australia's oil and gas journey. So very similar to Norway, we started in the mid to late 1960s. Made large discoveries, very sort of similar to the North Sea, but that's where the corollaries stop, because Australia, unlike the UK and Norway, we didn't go down the path of deciding to have a independent, nationalistic-oriented approach to the development. Instead, what Australia did was embraced sort of what we would call the North American approach, which was the big oil companies come in, they develop our resources, and in fact, our policy for a long time, and including today, reflects that in that our petroleum policy is about attracting investment, It's about making sure that large international oil companies come into the jurisdiction, invest heavily, and in that case, we have a very light touch regulation. We've utilised the work program bidding as the process for granting licences. What that means is that companies say how much they're going to spend and what they're going to do, seismic survey, drilling, those sorts of things. So unlike the Norwegian from 1972, where they were able to put conditions on you must train and skill as part of your award of licence, as they sort of used a whole range of discretionary allocation criteria, Australia didn't. We used a bidding criteria, which meant the one that bid the most wins, which means we couldn't actually stipulate any conditions. Now, that was fine when we were looking in the Tasman and developing first of our resources in Bass Strait, which is in the southern area of Australia. Then in the early 1980s, a windfall occurred. And what we had was this area called the Northwest Shelf, which is off the northwestern area of Australia, sort of towards Indonesia, well, very, very close to Indonesia in the 1980s. And what we found was gas, and lots of it. And I mean, squillions and squillions of cubic meters. But there's one big difference between Australia and Norway. And this is takeaway number one. It's not the size that matters, it's where you are. So for Australia, our problem is our location. So for us, we were producing oil in the first instance for the domestic market in the 70s and early 80s, and continually, actually. So we weren't so much wanting to export, but to solve our national oil import problem. But the gas in the Northwest Shelf was another story. We're talking about abundance and then some. And in fact, Australia now is the largest exporter, or was the largest exporter of LNG in the world in 2020, or 2019. 2020 did a few things with COVID. But what that meant was Australia had to find markets for their gas and develop the LNG industry. Now, even to this day, we still have fields, massive fields, that are laying fallow and haven't been developed and sit on retention license because we can't pipe it out. There was no point sending it to some of our neighbours who, like Indonesia, had abundant gas. So our markets are Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, now China, Taiwan, that sort of thing. So it's about getting the gas to market. So that's always been on long-term contracts. So we've had this sort of, and this is an Australian problem, is this sort of the tyranny of distance. And that has affected our ability to really see how we see ourselves in the world. And we've always, in my view, sold ourselves short. And because of that, the last thing we wanted to do was say to an international oil company, well, you can come here and develop our gas for us. Oh, and by the way, there are these things that you have to do. Because there was, and still is, a sentiment, a national sentiment, that we're not worth that we should be grateful that they come. And I think that's another takeaway that we should really be aware of. And I see this in some African countries, and that is, what is your attitude about yourself? Do you think you're a big player? Are you grateful or desperate? And it's these sort of almost psychological stances of a nation that will play into whether local content and stipulating local content is something that you can do. I've looked at and examined Norway for a very long time, and Norway is an extraordinary country in that it's for 5 million people, and a sort of icy, rocky, although beautiful place. It's got a lot of nerve to say, well, this is what it is, and if you don't like it, go away. But what Norway's got is location, 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 and that is increasingly Europe is needing the gas and oil, and increasingly the market is just on its doorstep. And the same again, Catherine was mentioning, 1970s was this time when local content provisions were put in through the licensing regime. It's also the time of the oil crisis and the changes in the Middle East. Australia had no such bounty. So when the Northwest Shelf was discovered, we did look at local content, and we looked at it seriously for the first time. And in fact, there were two government reports. One was by a left-wing Labor government, and the report of the committee said this. They said that they agree with the sentiments expressed by the submissions, and they agree that the major natural resource projects, such as the Northwest Shelf project, because they're exploiting non-renewable resources, it should contribute to the economy in more ways than just direct revenue, taxes, royalties, the like. The report said actually they should also contribute to developing the nation's infrastructure, creating wider skills base, providing expansion and development opportunities of Australian industry and Australia itself. And they also said that because in order to develop petroleum resources, you've got to have government licenses, for production, for export, then the government has an opportunity to put those conditions on and make sure that Australians get direct benefits. Indirect benefits, as well as the revenue and that sort of stuff. And in fact, the committee said that they, and I quote here, they were bewildered at an apparent lack of any real concern or consideration given by the Department of Primary Industries and Energy to the broader significance of Australian industry participation in resource development projects. So this is at a really critical time, and the report was essentially completely ignored, which Australia is actually quite good at. We just sort of ignore things and we let it go away. 10 years later, another report. The Northwest Shelf is starting to wind up. By 1998, you've got Japan really needing our energy. And so a second report called A Sea of Indifference. So the first report was called A Sea of Lost Opportunities. The second one was called A Sea of Indifference, Australia's industry participation. And that second report, also by the Parliamentary Committee, reaffirmed the view from the first report and said there was a need to champion Australian industry and have commitment to the views of the initial report. Most particularly, it said that we needed to develop engineering facilities and provide common use facilities, particularly in Western Australia. Now, we did actually develop that. Something called the Australian Marine Complex was the closest we came. And there we did shipbuilding, technology, fabrication, and support for, defence, petroleum, resources. So not just petroleum, but a broader. And again, there was this call for, well, if we're giving out exploration and production licenses, when a project is proceeding, part of it should include local industry involvement and local content provisions. And of course, that was completely ignored. And so the question, the title of my chapter is, has the ship sailed? And I would have said in the offshore industry, the ship has completely sailed. I do also mention in the chapter that onshore, not in petroleum, but onshore in mining, through our Indigenous, it's called the Native Title Act for our First Nations people, we have something called an ILUA, Indigenous Land Use Agreement. And part of that is there has to be an accumulated benefit to the Indigenous people, but that's under native title. So if an activity was to occur on land that wasn't native title land, there would be no requirement. Okay? And so that is just purely contingent on where the activity is taking place in a physical sense on land. So if we had had this discussion a year ago when the chapter was written, I would have said to you, the world is in a depressing place in Australia. We have no local content requirements, and I feel that my country has really sold itself short. That's what I would have said, but I'm going to change my story now. So, as we are all aware, something called COVID happened last year. You probably will have also seen in the news that Australia and China are having a very large trade war, sort of very similar to the US, probably bigger in some ways because it's all about our coal and our wheat and all our primary industries. And the third thing that's happening is Australia realised with COVID that our manufacturing sector, which we sent offshore, the last of it was 2006. So we didn't even have a sector to develop anyway for local content requirements. because we didn't want manufacturing. So the Australian government has realised with COVID, only because of COVID, that the most stupidest thing we ever did was get rid of manufacturing, because we can't even do things like make PPE. So with COVID, there has been the development of a gas-led manufacturing recovery plan. Okay, and the way the Australian Constitution works is that all the individual states control onshore development. And up until now, it's been very commercial and corporate oriented, and local content is not a requirement. However, under Section 122 of the Australian Constitution, the federal government can control territories. And it just so happens that our largest territory, Northern Territory, which is about twice the size of France and has 200,000 people in it, so that gives you an idea of population sparsity, has got some very large gas resources. So the Australian government in the last 2 weeks has put out a plan. It's called the Beetaloo Basin Development Plan. And part of that is a 3-point effectively local content requirement plan. The first part is an investment into the, and the Northern Territory is essentially First Nations people, Indigenous people. It's primarily composed, and it's got all land councils and that sort of stuff. So the 3-point plan is this. It's $1.9 million has been set aside for the investment to do the establishment of the Beetaloo Aboriginal Economic Development Strategy. We've also got the requirement for any activity to provide regional benefits and regional development under the Regional Benefit and Development Strategy, as well as the establishment of basically in the middle of the outback, a place called the Barkly, which is a huge tableland, literally in the middle of nowhere, the Barkly Business Hub. And that is actually going to link into a bigger picture of developing the north, Northern Australia. So has the ship sailed? Yes, for offshore, but for onshore, the ship has been called back, it's back in port, and it's going to be very exciting. So thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Tina Hunter, for the very wonderful and detailed presentation. I guess you've given us something to think about in terms of the next project. Well, speaking of the next project, I would introduce Professor Eduardo Herrera, who has written extensively on this topic. He's published a number of books and articles on local content, and it was a great pleasure to have him contribute to this work on the experience in Brazil. Over to you, Professor Eduardo.
Oh, thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this, Damilola. And it's nice to see several colleagues here, like Tina, Catherine, Susan, and meeting first time here team. I'm mindful about the time as well, because I want to give time to team to speak as well. I'll try to be brief. And it's interesting as well, coming after, especially Catherine and Tina, because I come from a developing country, you know, I'm from Brazil. So, you know, I think, and I know many people like to compare with UK, with Norway, Australia, US, but in the day that the reality might be a bit different in a variety of different levels. So I think Brazil presents an interesting story. I will try to go brief to a bit more to the modern times, because historically speaking, Brazil was actually colonized by Portugal, then become independent in the 1800s, then become a republic. Then at the time it was very open in order to acquire so-called like concessions license. And then much later, we just find oil onshore around the late 30s, but it was very minimal. And then at that time we had the movement to control the resources. Then we created Petrobras, which was our national company. And for nearly 5 decades, where Petrobras was actually the one, as Tina mentioned, controlling the ship. It was whatever the ship was going was on the hands of Petrobras. But then actually we had a constitution amendment in 1995 that flexibilized the market in order to bring, as Tina was mentioned, the big players as well. And then we had at the beginning in the 1997, our petroleum law, around zero. And that's when we start talking a little bit more about local content. Interesting enough, and Brazil was running almost not necessarily every year based a round of bid rounds of oil and gas concessions at the time. Round zero is when Petrobras had the right to keep whatever they were investing, and everything that they were not investing, they had to return to possible investments. And at that round, there was no local content in terms of requirement. It was just a provision in the contract, the concession, that actually you need to give a very broad reference to you should acquire local goods and service to the local providers to the extent is possible and similar quality and price. And then moving on to the next bid rounds, and that's what I think which is interesting, is not specific to Brazil, not specific to Latin America, not specific to Africa or beyond. I think political instability, it is also a concern in several places. So you see what happened to Brazil is not specific to Brazil, that we change our policy according to the government. So different government in place, they might have enhanced the obligations in terms of local content or not. And then, for example, if you see the first rounds, round 1, 2, 3, 4, there was something very kind of not unique, but quite interesting that Brazil took that approach. We added local content as part of a bid parameter. And then what is the interesting thing here is that you might have a good intention on the back of your mind that actually you are trying to encourage investors, let's bid more aggressive on local content because it's very good, because in theory it's a win-win scenario, because as more they invested, that they will have a higher chance to win. And of course, they change throughout time from 15 to 40 to 20% until later on they cancel it. Why? Because the reality what you find is that people were bidding things that they know they could not do it. So they were bidding higher amount, and later they say, in our case, we have like an agency that controls most of the activities. They were asking the directors there, give us an exemption because we want to do more, but your country cannot afford, it's our fault. Please, exemption. There were so many exemptions, they create a policy for exemption. So at the end of the day, they realized that this is not a good idea. Then they try to say, maybe let's put minimum and maximum. That's a good way to go, right? Because maybe we can say the floor is here and then the maximum can go is there. Then they try to do all the different various in terms of putting the bid until they realize that it's not a good idea. Let's take out of the bid. Local content no longer a criteria for the bid. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. They continue to exist, but they are part of a contractual obligation. Another thing they learn as well throughout this past over 2 decades is that you need to be, I think it's very important when you deal with local content, not on local content, several other issues, you need to have a strategic plan, because they sometimes confuse ambition with reality. Oh yes, at some point in time we had local content over 80%. I mean, seriously, can you really give 80% on all of this variety of goods and service? Probably not. So why do you allow them to give 80%? So, so then they much more recent, of course, the past recent government is a bit more liberal. So they reduce local content obligations on a combination of low price of oil and then a combination of variety of different uncertainties that they wanted to support the industry. So they reduce local content on the consideration. So that's one thing to consider is before you put your local content plan, what is your reality? Have you done a serious assessment on, as Tina and actually Catherine was mentioned, the industries? Because Norway was very, very lucky that they had very good shipping industry and they could actually tie in together. And then how about our reality? The good news about, not everything is negative, right? The good news about this policy that encourage amount of investment and encourage amount of, for example, Brazil invested significantly over the past few years into developing more infrastructure, harbors, ports that will be able to do, of course, similar to US and similar to UK, Norway, and a little bit Australia, we're mostly offshore. So onshore is less than 10% of our production, so not so significant. So in any case, so I think that's important to consider what your industry is related. Another thing that Brazil has done, which is interesting, is part of our contract obligation. 1% of production should be invested in R&D, research and development. Not specifically in local content, but it's interesting that you actually tie in about research and development into oil and gas and non-oil and gas to be able to deal a little bit of resource curse as well in order to bring technology. Because a key concern you have, especially if you go to Africa, Latin America, is that you need to rely a lot, not necessarily on people, but on foreign technology. So I think it's important that you think about technology-wise. In Brazil, certainly, we're among this, and I think many other developing countries face this issue. Local content might have a very good idea on sustainable development and bringing investment, but we also bring the negative: corruption, delays, increased cost, unfortunately. So that's why I think you have to be very careful. For example, Brazil is not dealing with this. Other countries, including in Africa, has this condition that in order to consider local content, you might not only be incorporated in the country, but you need to have ownership of local citizens. So we don't have that. So in that way, if you have that condition, you need to see how many local citizens can actually be able to qualify, or you're privileging a small amount of groups. Another thing that Brazil is slowly getting to that, Mexico is doing this as well, and a few other countries is looking into this more seriously, small, medium enterprise. Because in the day that when you look about local content, are you talking about the large service providers, or you're also looking about small, mid-sized players, and how those guys get funds to compete, to be part of the game? So the government need to think about how that comes to play as well. And certainly for us, the developing world, key issue in local content, auditing. And because one thing is what you say, another thing what you promise, another thing what you do. And then in the day that, how does that work, you know? And I think that having an independent body dealing with that, I think that's very welcoming. Sometimes they let the national company handle that, which might have some challenges in doing that. Brazil, we created a smart system, which is like a certified third parties. So the National Petroleum Agency qualify certain entities that would work as outsourcing to do certification. So they would facilitate the process that whenever they send the certificate, the government will be able to have more clear information what is complied or not. Of course, you need to make sure that this process is transparent and is legitimate. But anyhow, otherwise you might have very challenging is how do you monitor hundreds of contracts with dozens of players and multiple layers of service providers to know exactly that percentage is 20, 40, 50%. So otherwise you rely on whatever the company say, oh, I'm complying or I'm not complying. So that's why working on auditing, working on that point of view, it is very important as well. Otherwise, you face significant challenges to do. And I think what I agree to a certain extent when Catherine was mentioned that the flip side of the coin that, oh, we give you access to this nice bonanza, but then you need to give us back something. And that part of this give back local content. But I have several colleagues also, not only in Brazil and beyond, working for mid-large size oil and gas companies. They also come with an interesting point, is this that, well, your minimum requirement is 20%, 40%, 50%. If I go beyond, I mean, like, what is the incentives? Of course, you might get incentives that, well, you actually getting more local benefits. You might get a good PR and you might be saving costs. But how about going beyond that? So Brazil had implemented some policies to try to give credits to a unit on how much work you do on different types of the industry that kind of incentives you to do more. But we haven't gone so far as, for example, Indonesia, that actually part of their profit splits, they consider the local content. So there is not so much a significant fiscal incentive to do more. So you actually want to go beyond your 50, 60, 70, 80, whatever percent. So I think this is something that Brazil is considering on how to work better. And also we have, as you mentioned, flexibility is something that the government has some way to work around that. Similar to Norway, we don't have a law on local content. So that one, in our case, is a bit much more from a contractual obligation. Also some regulatory means that the National Petroleum Agency can implement. And then that ways gives them more flexibility, as you have seen in the history, if you read the chapter as well, that Brazil changed these conditions in year to year, because it was not actually something that has to go back to the parliament to get approval, because that would be a bit more challenge to work around. So I think that the key takeaways I'll give from Brazil, because I know Tina is about to come as well, and you still have questions and answers as well, is one, especially in the developing world, is that look into reality check. Because I know that sometimes we love about ambition. Of course, we want to get somewhere, but how to get there? So you need to know where you are today and do a proper study to understand your weakness, your strength, and then you focus. Maybe in some countries, maybe the issue is about technology, some is about services, some is about people, some is all of them. So you do this reality check, have a long-term vision. I agree with Catherine as well. Local content is good, but for how long? At some point, should you be able to compete in equal terms locally and internationally or not, So I think these are just in a very nutshell, Damilola, a short view on lessons from Brazil.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for the insightful presentation. I guess the takeaway from you is that local content must start with local context. You must check the context first to see what is going to work in a country. So thank you very much. We'll turn it over to Professor Tim Meyer, who's going to give us some perspectives from the US. I just want to say again that feel free to drop in your questions in the chat, and then we should be able to have time for one or two questions after Professor Tim's presentation. Over to you, Tim.
Okay, great. Thank you, Damilola, and I'll try to be brief here to make sure we have time for questions. So let me just join everybody else in congratulating you on an excellent volume that you've put together, and thank you for your leadership in putting together this book. Congratulations also to my fellow contributors and panelists, and I also want to thank Zachary Sturman, who's my co-author on the chapter that I'll be talking about now. So as some of you may know, today is hopefully an auspicious day in the United States. We are inaugurating a new president, Joe Biden, and this book and this panel is actually quite timely given the inauguration of President Biden, because just a couple days ago it was announced that one of the President-elect, soon to be President Biden's first moves will be to expand the use of local content rules, the expansion of the Buy American program in the United States. That's going to be joined with his series of executive orders that are going to essentially reintegrate the United States into a variety of international regimes that pursue the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular the Paris Agreement. This book is coming at, from the point of view of the United States at just the very perfect time to be thinking about the relationship between local content rules and the way that those can promote a variety of sustainable development objectives. The incoming Biden administration appears very focused on the nexus of economic growth, economic development, local content, and sustainable development, particularly in the environmental context. So very timely book. So our chapter here does a couple of things, and again, I'm going to try to be a little bit brief here. But one of the things we do is sort of survey the history of local content rules in the United States as a way to think about their use in the energy context. And there's a couple of dimensions that I think in the United States are worth thinking about. So the first is that the United States is a federal country, and so has historically had a quite decentralized economic regulation. Particularly with development of, with respect to the development of natural resources. Of course, some of our states in the United States are, if they were independent countries, would be massive economies. We think here of California and Texas in particular. Texas is a big, obviously, fossil fuel producing state. And there has been a role for local content in the development of the oil and gas industries at the state level in the United States. Part of the reason for that is that the U.S. Constitution forbids the use of tariffs and other forms of trade obstacles between the states in the United States. So this means that the states, Texas, California, Pennsylvania, if they are competing with each other to attract, for instance, investment, they can't use some of the forms of protection for their local or domestic economies that are available to nation states. They have to look to these forms of regulatory barriers that are either harder to challenge or at least less likely to be challenged. And so the restriction that was put on, over 200 years ago on the states in the United States that they couldn't use, in particular, tariffs as a way to protect their local economies, meant that you saw a turn to these kinds of local content rules. There's a framework in U.S. domestic law, something called the Dormant Commerce Clause, that regulates the state use of local content rules, and a straightforward local content rule, one that just obviously conditions a government benefit on the use of local services or supplies, could be found to be unconstitutional under the Dormant Commerce Clause. But relative to the scope of these programs at the state level, we really don't see the number of challenges that you might expect. At the federal level, the use of local content really became much more popular in the 1930s. The Buy American Act was passed in 1933. And at the federal level, the really important distinction is going to be between government procurement, that is local content rules that are going to apply to consumption that the government itself engages in, versus subsidies or other forms of government benefits that are available to the private sector as a condition of engaging in some kind of activity. The federal government has been much more historically engaged with LCRs where government procurement is concerned, as opposed to other forms of government benefits. The Buy American Act was designed to basically retain some of the development advantages of the massive amount of government spending that began in the 1930s as a way to get out of the Great Depression, and then ultimately the development in the United States that came after the Second World War. But was to a very large extent eviscerated by the United States joining or helping to create and then ultimately develop the GATT and the World Trade Organization agreements. The Trade Agreements Act from the 1970s essentially waives Buy American, or allows the president to waive Buy American requirements for anybody that is a member of the government procurement agreement at the WTO or otherwise has a free trade agreement, so our NAFTA partners, for instance. This has had the effect of undermining the federal Buy American program, and has led to what I think is quite fascinating, a bipartisan in the United States interest in reviving local content rules at the federal level. President Trump, who will be leaving office in a few hours, was very keen on Buy American. He issued a series of executive orders that were designed to both expand Buy American, and in particular were designed to facilitate the use of American metals, particularly iron and steel, in energy infrastructure projects. So some of our pipeline projects that the incoming president appears poised to potentially cancel, including the Keystone XL project. Those kinds of projects, President Trump sought to use local content rules to incentivize investment in the energy sector in a way that was going to ultimately redound to the benefit of the U.S. Metal manufacturing industry that the President Trump sought to protect. The United States also used embedded local content rules, the federal government, in a variety of other kinds of development programs. And I'll just mention two very briefly here. The first is the Rural Electrification Project. So historically, of course, much of the United States is quite rural. One of the things in thinking about the SDGs, we often don't think of the United States as necessarily being a country that is targeted for sort of internal development, but in fact, it is an objective of the United States to develop some of these rural parts of the country. And the Rural Electrification Act contained an LCR that was designed to link the expansion of energy throughout the rural parts of the United States to certain local content rules. The other key point worth highlighting here is that U.S. Foreign aid and development financing has often sought to link overseas projects for renewable energy to the consumption of U.S. renewable energy technology. So the U.S. has been engaged in basically a trade war, particularly with China over many issues, but also over renewable energy. And what we might call local content rules tied to overseas development in federal programs have been one way that the United States has tried to basically make the use of U.S. renewable energy technology overseas more attractive than potentially cheaper Chinese technology. That's the federal level, and just in thinking about future research projects, I think the Biden administration is likely to actually set the table here in terms of telling us future research at the federal level. Just a couple of remarks about the state level here, and then I'll wrap up. So at the state level, we've seen, as I mentioned, a lot of competition among the U.S. states to attract investment. And I'm reminded of Tina's remarks about the sort of light touch regulation. A lot of this takes the form of tax competition that, although we don't necessarily think of these as being traditional LCRs, they are in effect tax benefits that are contingent on the consumption of local natural resources. And have played a particularly prominent role historically in the development of fossil fuel resources. And even in the present have been credited with the fracking boom in the United States, developing a technology that has made fracking. Eduardo mentioned R&D credits, and those have been an important feature of state and federal LCRs or LCR-like programs in the United States. More recently, the renewables, state and local renewable LCRs have become particularly contentious. In the United States, a huge number of U.S. states offer subsidies to either consumers or energy companies if they produce either renewable energy or renewable energy technology with locally sourced materials or technology. Those programs have come under fire in a tit-for-tat trade war. So the United States decided to bring a challenge to an Indian local content requirement that existed at the federal level in India. The United States was ultimately successful in that challenge, and as it had signaled all along, India responded with a challenge to these state and local level renewable energy requirements in a variety of U.S. states, and of course, India was ultimately successful in that challenge as well. So what we've seen is really sort of a very, across these dimensions, fractured use of LCRs in the United States. We have federal and state requirements. We have fossil fuel LCRs and LCR-like programs. We have renewable energy LCR programs. And so there really has not been any sort of comprehensive effort in the United States to coordinate these LCRs across the state and federal levels and across different energy sources that might play into these kinds of sustainable development goals. Instead, there's really been what we might think of as a devolution, particularly to the states, to pursue their own local development policies. So I'll just conclude with sort of the punchline to the chapter, and then hopefully we'll have time for a couple of questions. So what do we make of that? So first of all, there are a lot of costs, and others have sort of alluded to these, some of these costs to these kinds of LCRs, and I won't sort of repeat the sort of conventional economic wisdom about LCRs, that they're inefficient. There are additional costs that flow from the federal nature of the use of LCRs in the U.S., that they are actually competing with each other, even within the United States, in ways that it can be detrimental to actually achieving their own goals in terms of local development. But when we think about sustainable development goals, one of the things that LCRs are, of course, quite effective at doing is generating political support for priorities that may otherwise go underfunded by the government. And I think the takeaway from the use of renewable energy LCRs, in particular at the state level, but also in some of these federal grant programs for overseas energy development projects, is that LCRs perform an incredibly important role in generating public support for investment in what is basically an under-subsidized relative to fossil fuel sector, and that's the renewable energy sector. That fossil fuel subsidies, particularly in the United States, have just dwarfed renewable energy subsidies, and LCRs have played an important role politically in leveling that playing field, and therefore pursuing some of the, particularly some of the environmental and health-related goals that are part of the SDGs. And so with that, I'll stop there, and hopefully we've got a couple of minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Tim, for that detailed and insightful presentation. I think you already touched on the environment and health-related goals that could be achieved with LCRs, and we have two questions here that touch on that. So I'll read them out, and then we can just get sort of concluding thoughts from each of the speakers, starting with Dean Susan. And the first question from Elena talks about to what extent are the environmental protection policies being included in local content policies along the lines of human rights concerns that Dean Susan spoke about. And of course, we have another question by Professor Al Lucas from Canada, who is asking here, is there any comment at all on the potential of local content requirements for accelerating low carbon energy transition? And I think that touches on a number of points that we've addressed here. So if we could just go around in terms of concluding thoughts and responses to these questions. Thank you.
Should I start, Damilola?
Yes, please.
Great, thank you very much, and I really appreciated hearing all of the remarks. In my presentation, I had looked at two countries, Nigeria and Ghana, and so in response to the question about is there express reference in the local content rules about human rights? No, and to me that is why this gap needs to be fulfilled. I think that it's fascinating in listening to some of the other countries, the extent to which a number of the issues in Ghana and Nigeria have not surfaced. And I think a lot of it does have to do with the specific situation and the resources and the legal culture that already exists, whether it be in Norway or the United States or in Brazil or Australia. Brazil, I thought I was waiting from Eduardo to see if we had any of the human rights community coming out in Brazil starting to raise issues, but he didn't mention that. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
Catherine?
Yes, I would like to comment on Lucas' question regarding the possibility of using LCRs for accelerating carbon energy transition. That's a very good question because, and I'm not sure I have yet the answer, it could be a good research article, because usually the LCRs have been used for the contrary of defending national industry in a very pro-industrial nationalist view, more than just for the purpose of accelerating energy transition. And we have different examples that Tim's mentioned as well, the WTO, where local content requirements have been challenged under the TRIMS agreement, the GATT, etc., etc. And usually they are not successful in that. They have to remove the local content requirements. And there was a new agreement as well to ensure that we will remove for the key low carbon technologies, those local content requirements. So the question is, can we find a justification in terms of proportionality test, different objectives that need to ensure low quality in carbon energy transition, and how can local requirement can accelerate the energy transition at the local level? I think the answer is not yet clear, and many countries, including Norway, starting to rediscuss local content requirements. So to follow up.
Thank you, Tina.
Look, I think it's really an interesting question, and it's something that Australia struggles with here. The way that we're approaching the energy transition is essentially taking our gas and converting it to hydrogen and storing the carbon, establishing essentially blue hydrogen. And with that is part of what I've talked about, this Beetaloo Basin thing, but also there's a very big push on in Australia in terms of things like developing green steel and green aluminium. Now, as I said before, in the 80s and 90s, Australia just lost manufacturing, particularly making steel. So we send raw materials offshore. But we've come back to this idea of enhanced use of our natural resources. So processing, critical minerals, these sorts of things. So the local content provisions are not going to be traditional in terms of, you must use Australian companies or whatever, but it's about value enhancing either bulk commodities or rare earth minerals in a way that either we haven't done for 30, 40 years, or that, like in the case of bulk commodities, or in the case of rare earth minerals, particularly lithium, that we're going to do because it's strategically clever. And I think that's where local content requirements are heading for Australia. It's this idea of value adding, value enhance, which, as Catherine will know, Norway got the value added idea 50 years ago. We're just jumping on that bandwagon now. So I think that's where we're headed.
Thank you, Tina. Eduardo?
Yeah. Actually, answering Susan, we don't have the local content in Brazil, Susan, anything related to human rights, unfortunately. So, and then actually, if you look in, especially to oil and gas, you see a little bit the rationale, because the more than 90+% is offshore. So I think the key challenge in Brazil more with human rights is deal with mining. Mining is a serious issue because there's a lot of areas which might be indigenous, restricted areas, but depends on the government in place. This current one was very open to open business, whatever. Previous ones were a bit more concerned. And in terms of second answer related to climate change, Brazil is in a better position than other countries because of the vast majority of our electricity comes from hydro. And also we are one of the largest investors in biofuels. From that perspective, we're not so bad, but still, I think that more could be done. And Brazil is very slow behind in terms of solar and wind, and is trying to catch up. And unfortunately, our local content provisions is heavily focused more on oil and gas sector, but slowly it's trying to move to renewables. And even R&D provisions are starting to require oil and gas companies to invest into also alternative sources and also looking for alternatives energies as well. So I think that the short answer is no, but transitioning to yes.
Thank you. And over to you, Tim.
Great. Well, thank you. So just to take the two questions briefly, the United States, I think, has not historically incorporated these kinds of specific considerations into the sort of text of its LCRs. Although increasingly the environmentally motivated LCRs are, the connection, at least to the environmental piece, not necessarily the human rights piece, is, it is relatively clear. I think that LCRs do have a role in the transition to a low carbon economy. I think you've seen that in the United States, both to a small extent at the federal level with some of these development programs that have LCRs in them to promote the export of U.S. technologies, but more at the state level, where you've seen the U.S. states really willing to put tax dollars to work in the form of subsidies for renewable energies, as long as they're able to retain some of the local economic benefits there. As I mentioned in my talk, there's a lot of examples of this that exist in the United States. But as I mentioned in my talk, the size of subsidies, either direct subsidies or tax benefits for the fossil fuel sector in the United States is so large that LCRs essentially act as a sort of a little bit of an equalizer, at least in the U.S. context. The real challenge, or at least one of the challenges going forward, is going to be the compatibility of these LCRs if we were to try to scale them up in the United States to really be much more significant economic programs. Their compatibility with both our federal rules that I mentioned, the Dormant Commerce Clause at the state level, and then ultimately, as Catherine mentioned, with our World Trade Organization commitments. That these cases I mentioned with India and the United States are not the only ones. There's a case against the Ontario program. The first really renewable LCR case was against Canada at the WTO. There are ways to try to write LCRs so that they are not explicitly LCRs, that tries to evade some of the problems under WTO law. But as Catherine mentioned, even those are often not very successful, and you end up embroiled in litigation. And I'll just conclude by saying, I think one of the things, if you follow trade law, there's going to have to be some sort of global reintegration also of the United States into the World Trade Organization. The Trump administration took a very adversarial posture with the World Trade Organization across a number of different policy dimensions. And I would expect that the Biden administration will be thinking, as it thinks about how it's going to approach the World Trade Organization, about trying to incorporate some of these sustainable development goals as they relate to both the nexus of environment and local economic development. They'll be thinking about how to incorporate that into any sort of reset with the World Trade Organization going forward.
Well, I think Tim just summarized chapter 3 of the book, which our contributor from Hong Kong did talk about this LCR and low carbon transition and the WTO. So thank you, Tim, for that great summary. And you can see that there's a lot, and there are a lot of angles to view this question of local content from. And hopefully this will be just the beginning of the conversation. Hopefully we'll be able to have another panel in the future where we'll bring in the other contributors, especially from Canada, from Hong Kong, and from the other parts of the world that were represented in this book. I want to thank our speakers for sharing their time with us. In contributing to the book and in discussing today. It's been really wonderful. And let me just invite the Dean Susan, to please give us the closing remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again, Damalola. And I would also like to thank my colleague, Sandy Amanis, who's been essential in making this event come together. But Damalola, for your leadership in bringing together a large number of scholars from around the world. If anything, today's session I thought was fascinating in learning about the countries and the differences and the time we're in. Obviously, for the United States, it's an important day, and Tim was able to shed light on what potentially could be on the horizon. I think it's important in looking at this subject that we look at both the public and the private, and I think all of those both aspects were touched today as well, and a really comparative presentation was developed. So on behalf of the Hamad bin Khalifa University College of Law, where we have a really strong comparative tradition, I think that this session today fit in beautifully with the way that we teach our students. So I would like to again thank everyone for their contributions and wish you a very good day.